I always tell people there's no gold star for using all the principles. Your gold star is when you hear yes. And if you form such a tight relationship because you start connecting on things, you're like, oh my gosh, you're brother from a different mother. That may be enough for somebody who maybe in their past they were burned by somebody and now they trust you more. So it's just a matter of using the right principles when they're naturally appropriate and not thinking that I've got to do this like one thing to get them to say yes. It might happen, but it might be a sequence that you're going through over the course of time where you've built this momentum where somebody has got to know you, they like you, they trust you, they recognize your expertise, they realize they're not going to get something that you're offering elsewhere. All of that combines to make it much easier for that person to go, I want to do business with you.
Welcome, Model FAs. David Sell here, president of Model FA and your host of the Model FA podcast. And our guest today, Brian Ahearn, actually comes twice recommended from previous guests that we've had. One is Patrick Galvin and two is Ivan Farber. So big shout out and thank you to those folks. And it's a good reminder too that we're very much open to having guests on the show. So if you have anyone in mind that you think could be a good guest, that would be fantastic and well received by us. With that being said, looking back into 2022, we've had a good variety of guests from financial advisors to industry related folks to folks who aren't related to our industry specifically, but their teachings and their ideas can certainly be applicable to your everyday life. So looking forward into 2023, based on some of the feedback that we've received from all of you, we will be having a heavy focus on financial advisors and interviewing them, learning about best practices, learning about their journey, learning about how they go above and beyond to serve clients. So if you or another advisor that you know could be a good guest, feel free to reach out and we'd be happy to have a conversation about that. But with that being said, Brian Ahearn is the Chief Influence Officer at Influence People LLC. And we're going to be talking about a few different things today that all sort of build off of one another. So one is going to be discussing the principles of influence. Another is going to be selling to different personality types. And I'm really intrigued about this topic here. In our digital material that all of our clients get access to, we have a video that talks about how to sell to different personality types. So I'm curious to get Brian's perspective on that. And then also talking about the 8 different steps to a sales process. So I know everyone has sort of their own sales process that differ, but oftentimes rhyme with one another, so to speak. So with that being said, I'm excited to, get Brian's perspective on what those 8 steps are and if all of them or some of them could ultimately be, put into your processes as well. So with that being said, Brian, welcome to the show.
Hey, I really appreciate you having me on, David, and I am looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. And Brian, you are the first guest to welcome me, which is nice. I know the full length is on audio, but for those of you who see some of the video clips that we put out there, he has a nice sign behind him that says, "Hi, David," with the Model FA logo, his books as well. So I appreciate the time and attention to detail that you have. Great first impression.
Well, that's what it's intended to do. It's a great starter. When I have sales calls and people see that, it just flows right into what I do. So thanks. I appreciate you noticing.
Love it. Well, you're having an influence on me already, and perhaps that's a nice segue into that topic. But before we focus on that topic, I want to help set the stage as to your background. So your company now is Influence People LLC. Perhaps this is the case, but I'd be shocked if, fresh out of school, this is what you got into. So I'm curious to know what that first job was and how you progressed ultimately to the point where you are today.
Well, first job was in the insurance industry as a personal lines underwriter. Really knew nothing about insurance. Sounded like a great job, worked for Travelers Insurance. Best thing I got out of the industry, though, is I met my wife on the first day of work. So that was pretty nice. But as I went through my career on the underwriting side, being a very analytical person, I got to be honest, David, I thought that selling was a bunch of BS. I was, you get beat down by insurance agents wanting the lowest price. And as an underwriter, you're trying to determine price, coverage, conditions, and things. And selling just wasn't something you thought a lot about. But about 10 years into my career, Somebody came into the department that I was working in. I had moved into the sales department, and I learned more from John in 1 year than I had learned in my first 10 in the industry. And I realized selling is really important, and what you say and how you say it can make a huge difference. Well, several years later, I came across the work of Dr. Robert Cialdini, who was a social psychologist who worked out of Arizona State University, and what he calls the principles of persuasion. When I was exposed to those through a video, the light bulb came on, and I immediately understood the psychology that he's talking about is the underpinning of all selling. It explains why certain approaches work and why certain approaches don't. I love the fact that it was research-based, and I also appreciated his stance on ethics. And so I started utilizing that material in the early 2000s in everything that I was doing in sales training and anything that I was doing at the insurance company that I was with. As fate would have it, I ended up connecting with Dr. Cialdini. He came to Columbus, Ohio in 2004, spoke to the insurance agents at our company, and then ultimately I got certified to teach his methodology on his behalf. And that was in 2008. And once I did that, I started to see down the road, like, hey, I could do some work outside of the insurance company. I could speak and train and do things. And I started to envision that one day, whenever that day was that I left the company, this is what I would do full time. So I really began to apply myself to learning my craft as well as I could, focusing on my speaking, training, coaching, consulting, started blogging, started writing a first book, got the website, did all this stuff to build the momentum. And then that time came in November of 2018. I decided it was time for me to leave. There were certain things happening I just didn't agree with, and it was better to leave than to be a detractor. And I stepped into this 4 years ago, and it's been awesome.
Love it. So talking about persuasion, before we get into the principles of influence, I think oftentimes the word persuasion can get somewhat of a negative rap to it and a negative connotation. Personally, I don't believe it to be that, although I think that persuasion in the right hands can be extremely powerful and impactful. In the wrong hands, it can be pretty detrimental if a bad person knows how to use it as well. So for those who may have a negative connotation around persuasion and the word itself, can you help us dispel that to kick us off?
Sure. When I think about persuasion, I always default to Aristotle's definition. Aristotle said that persuasion was the art of getting someone to do something that they wouldn't ordinarily do if you didn't ask. When you think about that, David, you've got people in your life that you want them to do certain things, but they have their other priorities. And how you communicate with them may make a big difference between hearing yes and hearing no. And the reality is this: we persuade every day of our life. I like to say womb to tomb. The moment that a baby comes into the world, it doesn't know what persuasion is, but it knows it has a need and it cries, and mom or dad have to figure out, do we change the baby, burp the baby, feed the baby? But that baby is doing what it can to communicate to get a need met. And through the entirety of our life, we are trying to persuade people, getting them to change how they think, feel, or behave, because we might need it for work. We may need something at home, but it's a 24/7, 365 skill.
So with persuasion, is it a way that you carry yourself? Is it the words that you use? Is it a process that you bring people through? Is it all the above? Persuasion is just a word, but how would you actually define it in implementable terms?
Well, it encompasses everything that you said: how I carry myself, what I wear, how I speak. All of those things are creating an impression that either causes people to listen more closely or not. For example, if I go on stage for a speaking engagement, if my shoes are all scuffed up and people look at that and go like, wow, can't believe that guy didn't polish his shoes. All of a sudden I've lost some credibility. They're not focused on the message, they're focused on the shoes. So everything about my persona is either helping or hindering my cause. Now, certainly the words that we use, the gifts that we give, how we interact with people, all of it is a part of persuasion. And then certainly there is a process to it. So it's something that everybody does it every day, like we breathe every day. But then there are people who teach you how to breathe so that you can meditate, so that you can run better, work out. And what I want to do is teach people, what does the research say, so that they can get better at their attempts to influence the behavior of other people.
So in coming across advisors and honestly salespeople in general, I think some industries can be a little bit more aggressive than others. And just to kind of set the stage around the two opposite ends, and then what I would like you to talk through is the principles of influence in relation to me teeing it up this way. So I find that there's kind of two sides of advisors, generally speaking. One is like the super hard closers, kind of aggressive sales tactics. And then there's the super soft sales folks that, in my opinion, are a little too passive, and they struggle with driving people to take action, but they're so scared of coming off as the other end of the spectrum, which is too aggressive. And I'd like to believe that there's a happy medium, and perhaps that's where influence comes in. So talk to me about the principles of influence as you've learned them, as you see them, as you teach them. And then I'll sort of cherry pick some points that you make and try and apply them to financial advisors specifically.
Well, the first thing I would say about the two ends of the spectrum is I think you're right. Nobody wants to feel that there's a hard sell or a hard close. I mean, that makes people resist quite often. But if you're too soft and you just say, well, get back to me when you can, people are busy and they've got other things going on and fear of change. And there's all of that stops any momentum. And so there is a place in between. And we like to talk about informing people into yes. By using these principles that we'll start talking about, they cognitively make it easier for people to say yes. And so, people ask the question all the time, what's the best way to close? And my first response is, when you meet somebody for the first time, you look them in the eye and you shake your hand. Everything builds on that. And if you're doing it well, then closing is just a natural progression of the conversation that you have been having over whatever period of time. Okay. So now when it comes to these principles, there are 7 principles that we talk about. And the first principle is the principle of liking. We prefer to say yes to those we know and like. Everybody gets that. But let me share with you, David, the secret to that principle. It's never about me getting you to like me. It's always about me coming to like you. And by connecting on things that we have in common, by offering genuine compliments, you'll certainly like me a little bit more. But more importantly, I will like you. And when you begin to see, wow, this guy, Brian, he really seems to like me, he seems to care for me, that is what opens you up to whatever recommendations or advice I might be sharing with you, because you start to believe deep in your heart, right? Friends do right by friends, and this guy's doing right by me. And I am, because I've come to like you. So for me, that is the foundation for everything. It starts with getting to know and like the people that you work with and the clients that you serve. Then we move into what we call reciprocity, the natural obligation to give back when somebody first gives to us. But if I've laid the foundation with liking, then my giving to you is genuine. It's not a sales tactic. It's not just to get you to do something. It's because I truly want to do something that's beneficial for you. And again, if I've laid that foundation, you receive that giving in an authentic way. And you're like, wow, that guy, Brian, again, it just opens you to want to help should I need something from you. So I'm never doing it to just pull this lever and like, okay, David, I just gave you a Starbucks card. Now you got to do me a favor. I'm giving you the Starbucks card because I've come to know you and I was thinking about you. And I just thought that would be a kind thing to do. So liking starts changing even our acts of reciprocity. From there, we move to what we call unity. Now, unity can't be manufactured, but unity is about a shared identity, that it's easier for us to say yes to those who are of us, that we have that shared identity. And the best example that I can give you and your listeners is my father, who served in the United States Marine Corps during Vietnam. From the time I was a child, I could always tell when Dad met another Marine, it seemed like he was closer to him than me, his own flesh and blood. And I began to understand that when I learned about unity, that there is a bond. And my dad even wrote this, there's an invisible bond that joins them forever. And so when you have unity with somebody, your acts of kindness, help, or whatever it is that you're doing are almost helping or kindness to yourself because you share this identity. And so, when you understand that there's true unity there, you want to make sure that you talk about it early and often because it will bond you and it just makes the business relationship so much easier. So let me just pause there in case you've got questions before we move on to the other 4.
Yeah, so I've been taking some notes along the way just so I don't forget anything. So liking, the way I interpret that is sort of like meeting them where they're at and finding, connection points or what have you. Reciprocity, I wrote down giving without expecting anything in return. And that could be a gift, that could be a note, that could be a phone call. In our industry, specifically with our clients, we have a process that's called a give to get offer, where you give something of high value to the client to be able to get their time and some information in return. And it could just stop there. So that's where like the genuineness comes into the equation. So as an example, if you think of an entire financial plan as like a pizza, there's different slices of that pizza, different slices and parts to that financial plan. Well, if there's something that's incredibly beneficial to the client or the prospect, easy for you and your team to perform, so you're not creating a bunch of, free work for yourself, you can say, hey, so far in our conversations, we've talked about a multitude of things. Why don't we test each other out to start? So why don't we take care of this, whatever that offer is? Why don't we take care of this for you? It will give you an understanding about our process and kind of how we work with folks. Whether you decide to continue conversations or not, you're going to walk away with clarity and answers to this problem that we had discussed. Does that sound fair? So I kind of relate reciprocity to that offer that we provide. And then where I guess I'm confused is on the unity portion.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, it's finding some common ground, but I'm curious to hear from you, Brian, how it sounds very similar to liking. So how do we differentiate the two?
So we can not know anything about each other and find out we cheer for the same football team or some other sports team, have the same pet, any number of things we could find in common. And very quickly, we'll start feeling like we like each other. Or again, if I paid you a genuine compliment, for example, you paid me a genuine compliment earlier, and I really appreciated that about the background and your logo. Those little acts can cause us to start liking each other. But unity is about, again, a shared identity. The deepest level of unity would be family. Okay. There are people in our family that we would do things for, and maybe we don't even like them as much as some other people, but because they're family, right? We are genetically wired to do what we can to keep our line going. And so that's why sometimes we'll do things for those family members, distant relatives, again, that we may not even really like or know too well, but we wouldn't do that for other people because of that unity, that shared identity. The Marines are a great example. Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, I have a friend who's sober 32 years. Al would do anything for somebody who's struggling with alcohol because his helping them does wonders for himself too. Now, he's not helping them just so he can feel good, but there's something about in unity that what you do for that other person almost comes back to you. And that's not necessarily the case just with somebody that we like. So it's much deeper and it really can't be manufactured. But when it's discovered, as I said earlier, talk about it.
Okay, cool. So I do have a follow-up question, but I think it would be related to some of the other principles. So I'm going to hold on to that for now. And let's get back to number 4.
Okay. So the fourth principle we talk about is authority. And authority is just about the fact that when we're making decisions, we feel better when we defer to somebody who has superior wisdom to ours or some kind of expertise. Now, all the financial advisors compared to the people that they're dealing with, you are experts, but you may be much more of an expert than somebody realizes. And so it's incumbent upon you to make sure that they know about that expertise, but without bragging, right? You don't kick the door down and go, David, let me tell you how great an advisor I am. But I have subtle things that I can do. I might say, David, over, my 30 plus year career, I've worked with a lot of people who are in your position. And what I recommend is by dropping that nugget of 30 years, people equate expertise to time in an industry. I'm not bragging. I'm honestly sharing information. If you've got a potential high value client and you're going to have a meeting with them, can you get a third party to send an email or make a phone call or something on your behalf to build you as that expert? It's just the same as like when I speak, somebody always reads a bio, right? You read a bio for me at the beginning of this conversation. I wrote the bio. I wrote the bio that they used to introduce. So why not give a bio to somebody to make that third party introduction, because they can say things about you that if you say, you're going to sound like a braggart, right? So we need to be very conscious of making sure that the people we interact with know that we have expertise. The next principle that we talk about that aligns with that is social proof. And social proof just goes into the reality that as human beings, we're social creatures. And so we are heavily impacted by what other people are thinking, how they're feeling, and what they're doing. And if we can convey that information to a prospective client or a current client about how others have benefited from what it is that we're suggesting, then they are more likely to go along with that. And the closer that those people are that we reference to the particular client we're talking about, the more likely they are to follow that lead, because we naturally assume, well, if it worked for them and they're in the same position as me, then why wouldn't it work for me? So if I combine authority with social proof by making sure I talk about the fact that I'm good at what I do, I've done this for a long time, and I've helped lots of other people just like you, David, that becomes a powerful motivator for you to take action on whatever it is that I'm recommending.
Understood. So that's 5. What's the 6th one?
So our 6th one is consistency. And consistency describes the reality that we feel this internal psychological pressure, but also an external social pressure to be consistent in what we say and what we do. And it really boils down to this: word and deed. Human beings, as little pleasure seekers and pain avoiders, we feel a lot better about ourselves when we keep our word. And we also look better in the eyes of the people, that we have made a commitment to. So if we can get somebody to commit, and most of the time people don't do this, most of the time people tell somebody what to do. Well, that's not gaining any assent from the other person. But when I ask, so I don't say, David, will you get me your last 5 years tax returns? I don't tell you to do that. I ask you, David, would you be able to get me your last 5 years of tax returns by the end of next week? Pause, right? And you're either going to say yes or no. But if you say yes, you are much more likely to do that because you don't want to feel bad inside about having said one thing and then doing another. So the key really is stop telling people what to do and start asking. The final principle that we talk about is scarcity. And everybody gets this, right? In fact, many of your listeners probably experienced it last Friday, on Black Friday. The fear of missing out, scarcity. We value things more when we think that they're rare or going away. So if we can highlight what we're offering as positioning it as unique, like, hey, lots of financial advisors out there, but there aren't any others who are doing, A, B, and C. We do these 3 things for our clients that, to our knowledge, no other financial advisors are doing. That becomes a strong motivating factor for somebody to want what you're offering, because we hate that thought of losing out, right? If I can't get this from some other financial advisor, I'm going to start listening a lot more closely to you because I don't want to give that up potentially. So those are our 7 principles.
Okay, so let's go back to authority. And perhaps this is just in the example that you used that caused me to think of this question. But, if someone says, I've been doing this for 30 years, and what I found is people who are like you, and you're kind of dropping that little nugget. Mm-hmm. How does someone go about creating authority if they're newer in the career and they can't use something like time, if time is that natural authority builder?
So depending on how long they've been in the business. So somebody who's been in the business 5 years could even ask you that, because it might not be impressive to say, I've been doing this for 4 years now, but they might be able to say, I've got hundreds of clients. Or I could say, I've been doing this now for several years, David, and I've got dozens of clients who are very similar to where you are, right? So I'm using a little bit of that social proof because I can't lean as heavy on the authority. But you still have an opportunity, I think, for somebody above you in the organization to maybe set that tone. So again, if I'm going to have a meeting with you, I could go to my boss and say, hey, got this meeting coming up with this guy, David DeSalle, and it's going to be really important. Would you send some kind of communication to him in advance? So here you're getting an email maybe from the VP in the company, which you're like, oh, wow, that's pretty cool. And that person can build me up. And so maybe they say something like, Brian is newer to our firm, but the reason that we hired him is because he graduated cum laude from Miami University. And so they're building on other things to create a sense of excitement for you.
Okay, cool. Social proof, more of a note, not a question, but I see that you can leverage social proof through focusing on a particular niche, which is something that we talk to advisors about. So, we primarily work with entrepreneurs or physicians or, folks at your XYZ company, and what we've seen with them, and boom, social proof. So just more of a note.
And that's also giving you some expertise too, right? When you are in the niche, you really know, and these people are similar. So you're harnessing the power of two different principles there.
So from a consistency standpoint, it seems like you're giving, I feel like it's similar the way you positioned it as reliability, which is part of the likability equation, which is following through with what you said you're going to do, but also giving the folks that you're sitting across from the opportunity to do the same. Is that a fair statement?
Well, when you as an advisor do what you said you would do, you're gaining stature in the eyes of your client, right? They can rely on you. And that makes you more of an authority, because to really be an authority, you have to have expertise, but you have to be trustworthy. And by doing what you said, you are showing that you're trustworthy. When we talk about consistency, the focus is always on the other person. What have they said? What have they done? What do they value? What do they believe? What have they committed to? All of those things, if I can tap into those, make it easier for that person to say yes, because most of us don't go against what we already believe and value, what we've said or done. We tend to operate in a consistent fashion. If we have committed, we want to live up to our word. So I want your listeners to be really clear. When we employ consistency, it's about the other person. What have they said, done, value, believe, etc.
And then the final one, scarcity. So I understand examples like, Black Friday, Cyber Monday, things like that. However, I feel like out of all the points that you've made so far, to me, scarcity could be probably the most salesy one, or interpreted as the most salesy one. So as an example, anytime, I'm not doing the selling, but I'm in the opposite seat, I'm the buyer, and someone positions it like, if you sign up today, immediately I'm like, stop trying to sell me. And it rubs me the wrong way. I guess my question is, how do you combat leveraging that particular principle without coming off as salesy? Because I feel like there's a extremely fine line between the two.
Absolutely. And so your example is really good. And I'm sure listeners who are homeowners have experienced this before. They've invited somebody in because they're looking at maybe changing their roof, their siding, getting new AC unit, whatever it is. And so somebody comes in and they make their sales presentation. At the end, they say, now, David, if you sign today, I can save you 15%. But if I have to come back at a later date, I can't offer you this deal.
First of all, I feel like if they say no in that instance, they're never going to do business with you anyways, because now they perceive that, well, I would have to pay full price if I went to him.
But the reality is they're invoking a sense of scarcity. And if you were to say, well, why? Why couldn't you? Well, I'm too busy. I got to go see other clients. And I'm like, okay, wait a minute. This is not an easy sale. What's your close ratio? 1 in 10, 2 in 10? If I guarantee you a sale, you're not going to come visit me over a prospective client? Come on, this isn't real. But if there was genuine scarcity, so if somebody said, Brian, I can only honor this price for another 2 weeks, and that's because there was a hurricane in Florida, and we don't know what effect that's going to have on the supply of various building materials. And assuming I know there was a hurricane, that's legitimate, right? If I don't act within that time, some of those building supplies might not be available, or they might go up in price. So that's legitimate use of scarcity. For a financial advisor, nobody can predict what the stock market's doing, but it might be perfectly legitimate to say, David, they're contemplating another rate hike. And if that happens, here could be the repercussions. My advice would be, if we could get this thing going today, that's probably in your best interest. So there may be that legitimate opportunity that something could change in the future that would be a downside for somebody not taking action today.
Okay, so it's more so providing some sort of scarcity, but backing it up with additional context so it doesn't seem like an empty offer.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And so when you can refer to something, we've all seen the Fed taking the rate hikes, and however that's going to impact what it is that you're proposing. But you reference that and people know that's the case, and you've set yourself up already as an expert. You know what you're talking about. And you're saying, here's what the repercussions could be. All of that generates a momentum for them to go, this makes sense. Let's go ahead and do it, David.
Okay, cool. Now, my overarching question before we go into personality types is, do you need to check all 7 of those boxes in order to be in a place to influence someone to move forward? Or is it just like you need to have the majority of them? Because I think about the unity thing. Like, what if you're totally different backgrounds, you don't live in the same state, you like different sports teams, one's a carnivore, one's a vegan, like they're just polar opposites, but you check all the other boxes. How do you think through that?
Well, I always tell people there's no gold star for using all the principles. Your gold star is when you hear yes. And if you form such a tight relationship because you start connecting on things, you're like, oh my gosh, you're brother from a different mother. That may be enough for somebody who maybe in their past they were burned by somebody and now they trust you more. So it's just a matter of using the right principles when they're naturally appropriate and not thinking that I've got to do this like one thing to get them to say yes. It might happen, but it might be a sequence that you're going through over the course of time where you've built this momentum where somebody has got to know you, they like you, they trust you, they recognize your expertise, they realize they're not going to get something that you're offering elsewhere. All of that combines to make it much easier for that person to go, I want to do business with you.
So going into the different personality types in the course that we provide to our clients, we highlight kind of 3 main personality types that they may come across. And one of those is the millionaire next door, sort of more of a people who, like predictability and things like that. When you compare that to folks like the engineer style mindset that's very analytical. And then finally, we talk about the entrepreneur type of mindset. I share that not for you to pick on each one and try to apply your stuff to those particular ones, but just so you have context as to kind of how we talk through that.
Yeah.
Talk to me about, how do you identify different personality types? Perhaps what are they? And then from a high level, how should you approach those folks?
So when we're talking about personality styles, it's always about the other person. There's huge benefit to understand yourself, but really when you're in sales, you've got to understand the other person. You've got to be willing to conform somewhat to that other individual. The model that I talk about, I call deal, because we deal with people. We want to close deals as salespeople. And the 4 personalities that I talk about are driver, expressive, amiable, logical. So it spells deal. And here's the breakdown of it. There are people who are much more task focused than they are relationship focused. Those might be the people who would say, hey, it's 6:00 on Friday, but I'm not going to go out. I got too much to do. Where somebody who's relationship focused might say, I'll come in on Saturday and finish it because I want to go hang with you guys. So you make a demarcation. Is the person I'm talking to, do they seem more task driven or relationship? And then from there, we also look at, do they like to be in control? Are they more extroverted, et cetera? Or are they people who are more self-focused and not looking to control things? So we've got a quadrant now. The people who are task-oriented and like to be in control are the drivers. The people who are relationship-oriented, but also like to be in control, are the expressives. And then we move over to the amiables. Those are people who aren't about controlling others, and they're very relational. And then finally, the logical person. They are about getting things done. They're task-oriented, but unlike the driver, they're not trying to control others. Now, when we do workshops, we go into a lot more descriptions. We talk about who are examples of these different personality types to really get people thinking about that. But once we understand, if we've got a good handle, we are going to use different principles when we're talking with a driver versus an expressive. And we'll use different principles with an amiable or with a logical individual. So that's where the rubber meets the road. If I'm a very likable, nice guy, I don't try to win everybody over because, that driver is probably looking at their watch going, quit wasting my time. But the expressive person, they may want to really know and understand you. So I start to conform and I use different principles when I'm talking to those different personality types.
And is it at this point, I'm sure it's just your perception. You're probably quick to identify folks just based on doing this for a while now. But if I'm just now starting to be conscious of the fact that there's different personality types and I need to act differently and present differently depending on those personality types, how do you identify those? So like as an example, if someone's more analytical compared to more conceptual in nature, the silly question that I'll ask folks before I go through a presentation is, just so I can present this properly? Are you the type of person that just wants to know what time it is, or do you want to know exactly how the watch actually works? And that tells me stay in the clouds or get down to the details. So how do you identify if they're a driver, expressive, amiable, or logical if you don't yet have the skill of being perceptive rather quickly?
Well, I think the best thing that you can do, and this applies to all of persuasion, is know your audience. And so, I looked at your LinkedIn profile. You looked at my LinkedIn profile. We got to know a little bit about each other before we came on the show. If I'm meeting with an important client, I sure as heck better have done a lot of research. And that alone might be able to tell me what that individual is. For example, again, limited, but I would assume that you are a driver based on the fact that you talk about what a hard worker you are on your LinkedIn profile, voracious in terms of your learning. You just seem like somebody who is very driven. And so I learned that just by going on and taking a look at your profile. Now, that doesn't mean that you're not a relational and a nice guy. And I'm sure that you defer into the relational part too. You're not off the charts, but I would certainly think that you're like, I'm motivated. I'm getting stuff done. If it's got to be, it's up to me. That's the kind of personality I sensed from that. So then I would start thinking about which are the principles that would be most likely to have an impact for you. And that's what I would weave into the conversation. So the advice for everybody is don't just while you're in the office and look around. That's important, but do your research beforehand. Talk to people who might know the individual. And I'll give you one example. I had a meeting one time with a senior level executive at Nationwide Insurance, huge insurance company here in Columbus, Ohio. Through some research, I realized this person was connected to my old high school football coach. So very early on, I said, how do you know Todd Alice? And she's like, oh my gosh, he's my BFF at church. How do you know him? I said, I played high school ball for him. We bonded over this person who was really significant for both of us. So this really busy executive ended up giving me 30 minutes extra of her time. It was because I did a little research. So that's what you've got to do, I think.
Yeah, I like that too. And I was going to ask, and then that example made me think of it. What do you do if you can't find someone and their background online? But the reality is the majority of folks that advisors work with tend to come from client referrals. Mm-hmm. So perhaps, when that client makes a referral and you schedule that call, maybe day or two before, you just call the client and say, hey, Brian, I have a call scheduled with Ivan tomorrow. First off, thank you for introducing us. I'm excited to meet him, but also wanted to just connect just so I can make sure to be appropriate on my end. What type of personality type is Ivan? Like, is he relational? Is he like just wants to kind of get things done? Like, and you can kind of preface the question and then gain their insight so that you can head into that a little bit more prepared if in fact you can't find them or they're not descriptive on their bios and things like that. So any other ways to do it outside of just asking the source of that introduction?
Well, that's going to be the best thing. And now think about if you've leveraged liking and you really like that client, and because they also like you and you've helped them, they give you that referral. That's where it would be really natural for you to do something kind for them. And so maybe it is, I send you the $5 Starbucks card. Hey, David, I really appreciate that you made that connection to Joe for me. Have a cup of coffee and think about me next time you do, right? You get that and you're like, wow, that's really nice. Now, when I pick up the phone and call you and say, I've got my meeting with Joe coming up. Do you have a few minutes to talk? Well, you're feeling really good because of how I acknowledge what you did, right? Everybody's winning in this and it's all genuine. And so that's how I think you start utilizing these principles in ways. Now you're much more willing to talk about Joe. We have a great conversation. I'm going in locked and loaded to talk to Joe in a way that will resonate with him the best.
Cool. So let's go through, I know we're flirting with our typical podcast length, but let's go through quickly the 8 different aspects of the sales process. And similar to what we did with the 7 principles of influence, let's go through the whole list all at once, and I'll follow up with some questions and thoughts for anything that I want some clarity on, or I think our listeners may want some clarity on.
Okay. So I think this will be pretty routine for people who listen to this podcast. It starts with prospecting. However you're doing that, looking for potential new clients. First meeting. Your prospecting went well. You've got this opportunity for first meeting, looking to build rapport, trying to establish relationship there. Now, the rest of these can come separately, or some of them may blend together, but qualification. That could happen in the first meeting, or it could simply be that we've met. We seem to have some rapport here. And I say, David, would it be okay if we get together another time, maybe 30, 45 minutes to really kind of dive into your situation? So I'm going to go through qualification, trying to determine, can we do business? Do we want to do business? Once I've gathered all that information and I work on what I think is the solution, obviously I'm going to present that solution. From there certainly could be objections. There could be some negotiating, closing, and then hopefully getting to a point where you can ask for referrals. Now, the objection handling, negotiating, and closing, that might all happen right on the heels of doing the presentation. But I think each of those steps merits its own attention, and different psychology comes into play at different points. And so, when I wrote my book, Persuasive Selling for Relationship-Driven Insurance Agents, we walk through each of those and which principles of influence, just like when we talk about personality style, which principles would be most effective and why.
Understood. And I would say that's fairly par for the course in our industry and what I come across. I do want to add to that, though. I do believe that like if we say, the first meeting is step 2, right? I think there's like a step 2A and a step 2B. So just to give an example, after that first meeting, right, you're building rapport, you probably found either some common ground, be it, around likability or unity. So as an example, perhaps that is, I don't know, cooking. Let's just say I like to cook. So cooking. You guys connect on the fact that you like to cook. Well, perhaps when you follow up with them via email after that first meeting and you say, great meeting with you. As we discussed in our conversation, our next meeting will encompass A, B, and C. And just to make sure I heard you correctly, the 3 main pain points that we discussed today that you want to focus on is X, Y, and Z. If I misheard you at all, please let me know. Otherwise, I'll look forward to our meeting next Wednesday. Cheers, David. P.S. Here is my absolute favorite recipe. That's a staple in my home. Check it out. And if you end up cooking it, let me know how it comes out. Also, what's your favorite recipe? That little extra, like I give
Absolutely.
what, I was listening in a conversation. You can weave in little things like that throughout the sales process to humanize yourself, show that you care, and connect with them even deeper. And who knows, maybe they cook that meal and you're in their mind that whole time. There's additional mind share. They don't know why, because it's usually not conscious, but they like you even more because you spent more time with them from afar.
Yeah, absolutely. Within each of the steps, there may be multiple things that happen. For example, different advisor organizations, they may have like a 3-step prospecting, 5-step, whatever, but still thinking about whatever you're doing there, what's going to be the psychology that will probably most resonate with somebody to make them say, I'd like to meet with that person. I'd like to meet with somebody from the company. The first meeting and the building rapport, that rapport building can continue to happen, like you say, through sending an email, through the genuine giving, through reciprocity. So there can be lots of things that are happening, but at that high level, you're going to have that first meeting and that it's really important to establish rapport, because I like to say people won't do business with you just because they like you, but they'll almost never do business with you if they don't. Right. So it's incumbent upon us to really start making relationship. And you also have to be thinking, do I want to deal with this person? If I'm looking to have a client for 10, 15, 20 years, do I think I'm going to enjoy working with this person? So you're making that assessment as well.
Love it. So for our listeners, you should know the gist by now, but if it is your first time listening, one thing that we do ask all of our guests is a book that's had an impact on them. And it's a way to get their perspective on that book to hopefully encourage you to read that book if you haven't yet. And it's our way of kind of distilling a reading list for everyone that spends time with us on the show, as opposed to sifting through the hundreds of thousands, millions of books that are out there. So this should be no surprise after this conversation. This is not a surprise to me at all, Brian, but the book that you chose is The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I feel like it fits well into the scope of our conversation today. But talk to me about the personal and professional impact that that's had on your life.
So for me, the thing that I took away from the book was the chapter Begin with the End in Mind. And in that chapter, Covey talks about the need for a personal mission statement, sets it up by saying, imagine that you're at a funeral and you go up to the casket, it's you. What do you want people to say about you as they look back on your life? So he says, businesses have mission statements, but most people don't think much beyond the next paycheck or vacation. So I sat down over 30 years ago and over a weekend and wrote a personal mission statement. And I have read or listened to parts or all of it almost every day for the last 30 plus years. And it seeps into your soul and it just starts driving your behavior. For me, I put the number one thing is that when I die, I want to hear God say, well done, good and faithful servant, that I've lived a life that it was pleasing. And then from there, I said, well, I need to focus on my faith, my family, my personal well-being, and then my career. Now, just because career is number 4 doesn't mean that I don't put a lot into it. I'm very intense about everything that I do, but I will never let my career take precedence over my mental and physical health, over my family, or over my faith. That's just the order that I've got. And within each of those, I have aspirational statements, that I want my family to look at me as somebody that they can come to in times of need. I want them to be better people because they knew me. There's addition to that. But the point being, it's helped be a North Star for my career. And it's also been a North Star for me in my personal behavior.
Yeah, I read that book a while ago. So I got my career started actually at Northwestern. I was there for 7 years before getting into consulting. And they actually had like a workshop. I think it was over 3 or 4 days where there was a workbook that came with this actual book. And we spent a few days kind of diving deep. And I feel like a lot of the things stuck and have become, no pun intended, habitual in nature. Mm-hmm. But this is a good reminder to go back and review that because it's been a number of years since I've read that book. So I appreciate that.
But if you do write the statement, we are what we repeatedly do. And so as you read, or again, I listen to it, it's the first thing I listen to when I get up in the morning, and it just starts getting in your subconscious. And as most of your listeners probably know, your subconscious really is what drives your behavior in the course of a day. We learn, we put it in the subconscious, we don't have to think about it, and it just drives our day. So why not have something aspirational be in that subconscious and keep, without even consciously thinking about it, moving towards that?
Love that. Yeah, I've been thinking for some time. We're recording this on December 2nd. So I'm starting to get in the frame of mind for 2023 goal planning. And I've always written out my goals, but I've been reading and seeing a lot that turning your goals into audio and visual mediums help a lot. So I'll do that this year, see the impact that it has. And rather than reading it every day, can just pop in the AirPods to start off the day and consume it in that manner. So I guess I'll keep you posted on how that goes.
All right. I'd love to hear that.
Well, Brian, this has been fantastic. Some of the stuff that we've talked about today, I'd like to think that I do that. Other things, maybe not so much, but the organization throughout helps make it stick. And very rarely do I take notes on podcasts, but I have an entire notepad filled with some of the stuff that we discussed today. So I'll definitely be going back and listening to this episode, reviewing the notes. So I appreciate that. But if I'm listening to this and I want to scoop up one of your books, I'm thinking about having you speak at my firm, or I'm looking to figure out how else I can engage with you, where should I go?
Well, engage with me, reach out and connect with me on LinkedIn. And here's a guarantee. I will give a personal response to every person who does. I like to understand why people are reaching out. It's called social media, so we should be social. So you're going to have personal interaction with me if you reach out there. The other avenue would be my website, which is influencepeople.biz. When you go there, the books that I've written are available. In fact, if you sign up for my weekly blog, you'll get a free copy of an ebook that I wrote. But the other 3 books that I've got, which are available on Amazon and Kindle and paperback, there are links to those. But you're going to also see I've been on 150 plus podcasts. They're all listed. I've got videos. I've got previews to the LinkedIn learning courses. There's no shortage of information out there for somebody who wants to go deeper.
Awesome. And for those of you who are listening, I do have an ask, but also comes with an offer to help support your development as well as Brian, our guest, is if you would be so kind as to leave a review for the show, either how much you hate it, how much you love it, whatever you would prefer. Hopefully it's more on the love side. We would love that wherever you listen to podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, wherever, and just take a screenshot of that for me and shoot me an email with that screenshot. And in the subject line, write podcast Brian Ahearn, and that's Ahearn. just so I know which episode it's in relation to. And just let me know which one of his books you would like. And for the first 10 people that do that, I'll coordinate with you to get your address, and I'll go ahead and buy one of his books and send it out your way. Is that a good example of reciprocity, Brian?
Perfect example. Perfect example.
But yeah, so if you could be so kind as to leave us a review, you'll get a book out of it. I probably won't have a hard stop at the 10. So if we get a bunch of those in, happy to buy them in exchange for that review. So Brian, it's been a pleasure. Patrick Galvin, Ivan Farber, if you're listening to this episode, thank you again for making the introduction. And it was fantastic meeting you. Thanks so much.
It was my pleasure, David. Thanks for having me on.